Heard South Africa's headline unemployment rate has hit a record high of 34.4% in the second quarter. Now, this rate is the highest since Statistics South Africa's quarterly labour force survey began in 2008, with a total of 7.826 million people out of work in the 3 months to the end of June. Joining us to discuss and dissect this grim unemployment figure is researcher and economist at the Institute for Economic Justice, Busi Sibeko. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me here.
So, what do you make of the 2Q figures? Should they have been better, or are they in line with where we are with the COVID-19 lockdown story?
Absolutely, they're in line. I would like to say that I was shocked, but as our report shows, that there remain significant vulnerabilities in our economy, particularly leading up to the lockdown, to curb the level 3 sort of infections. And so we had indicated already that targeted measures were needed to rescue businesses, to sustain households, and also to, protect workers. And so these were not initiated or implemented at the time. So this is certainly not shocking outcomes given the failure to respond adequately to the crisis as it develops by our government.
I know that there's a time lag between A, collecting the data, B, the lockdown and the effects of the lockdown. So with all that considered, when do you think we might start to say we've hit the bottom, things should start going up from now?
I'm not exactly sure. We thought we hit, the largest unemployment rates in quarter one. It was the highest recorded by the quarterly labour force survey. But as we've seen in quarter two, we've actually gone even further down. And so what this indicates to us is that it could get worse. And fundamentally what is needed is a comprehensive macroeconomic plan to respond to the needs of the economy, to really rescue the economy that we have. It is, of course, harder to resuscitate the dead economy than to keep the one that we have alive. And so fundamentally, it is important that we think about what sort of measures are needed above and beyond the measures that have been put forward to respond to the looting and the violent protests that have taken the country, in the recent times. But to think about what more is needed in terms of policy response to ensure that we are dealing not just with the crisis that is emerging from the violent protests and looting, but engaging and responding to the broader crises that are facing South Africa, which are historical social economic processes that did not begin with COVID, but really have just been exacerbated by COVID itself.
Yeah, and it depends when you take the photograph, isn't it? But, I'm always reminded that before COVID, we were already in ICU. We had an economy in recession. So we had a patient who was in bad condition even before COVID. And so to talk about recovery, you almost have to go back to that pre-ICU moment and try and recover that patient. But in the meantime, he's had injections, he's had all sorts of things that have happened. And so the work is probably triple what it would have been dealing with the original problem.
Absolutely. I mean, there will be no recovery without rescue, which you rightly indicated that we were already in ICU to begin with. And so fundamentally, mass rescue measures are needed. But also a new set of rescue measures are needed. For example, a universal basic income grant. It is clear right now that South Africans are living below an acceptable social income floor, in our country, and it is critical that we try to balance that. It is really a threat to our socioeconomic stability in our country to have so many people living in a humanitarian crisis, which is, as we've rightly noted, has happened prior to even the crisis itself. So it's critical that we think about what are the emergency rescue measures that are needed and what are the long-term recovery measures that are needed. And these two need to speak to each other. right? It cannot be that we have rescue measures that are not linked to some sort of long-term transition, right? So if we think about what sectors are we rescuing, what businesses are we rescuing, we need to be thinking about what does a just transition in the longer term look like? Are we saving businesses that are detrimental to climate justice? And how that links to our broader economic plan. So it is critical that we link this rescue, resuscitating the patient in the moment, but also thinking about what is this patient's long-term sustainability plan.
Yeah, I want to talk about this just transition in a few moments, particularly when we look at women. But I'm just wondering, and perhaps you've given us a clue with some of your previous answers, are you getting any inspiration from the politicians, from the policymakers, about their clarity in what needs to be done and their ability to get it done?
It's a mixed bag, to be honest. I mean, for example, you think about the special relief of distress grant. We knew that the third wave of COVID was coming, yet the grant itself was discontinued, right? Our politicians should have known that it was coming and in fact continued it out, right? Because the crisis had ended, and the crisis hasn't ended, and it requires us to continuously be responsive to the crisis. So I think part of it has been the failure to acknowledge the importance of continuous rescue measures. Even though it seems that we might be recovering, no matter what GDP growth is doing, fundamentally what is happening is that people are losing their jobs. People are experiencing a particular type of economic reality, and we have to respond to that. And I think there's been a failure of socioeconomic planning to ensure that businesses, households, and workers are really adequately, rescued and taken care of during this crisis itself. I think in terms of the economic recovery and rescue package itself, it really is reminiscent of what we thought at the pre-COVID, and I think it is a moment where we have to rethink economics fundamentally. We need to rethink the macroeconomic policy of this country. When you see unemployment continuously increasing, it really calls for a different kind of macroeconomic approach, which our politicians have not demonstrated sufficiently and have decided to continue on the path of fiscal consolidation and what we call austerity, which I'd argue will continue to exacerbate the situation that we see in our country. It will rescue our country. In fact, it will only make matters worse.
So when we say these figures, 34.4%, 44 whatever percent, it's an aggregate figure. But when you drill down, actually what we see is that there are vulnerable groups in there that are in danger of getting left even further behind, women and young people. What kind of deliberate measures do you think we need to take to make sure that those groups are targeted and helped much more than they have in the past?
Yes, no, that's a very good question. I think, the stats that we're seeing in terms of who's vulnerable are just, a symptom of the broader problem. And this is, it's demonstrating the systematic inequalities that we've always had. Black women, even in 2018, Statistics South Africa was already indicating that for particularly Black women are vulnerable in the sector, and we haven't done anything since then to really deal with these structural inequalities that are preventing Black women and colored women in particular from being able to participate in the labor market. So I think it is critical that we rethink economics, how we understand the economy, the gendered economy, the intersectional economy, who's impacted by the economy and aggregate policies. So the problem of economics is that it assumes aggregates. It assumes that economic policy impacts everyone in the same way. And so this moment calls for a particularly gendered approach, an intersectional approach of policies. And I'll give an example. When we think about the special relief of distress grant, in the first wave that it was rolled out, or the first broader wave that was rolled out, it excluded caregivers, right? Because they were considered to be beneficiaries of grants, right? They were the ones receiving their children's grants and therefore they were excluded from that particular grant. And so that shows and demonstrates the inability to take gendered implications of economic policy seriously. And I think going forward, what is really needed is a gender responsive, a sensitive macroeconomic policy framework across board, and it requires that we think of social protection specifically also as a gendered arena in which we need to respond adequately to how people experience exploitation and oppression based on various, identities. And so that is fundamentally, I think, the one critical component is to say that in our country, what is needed is a rethinking of economics and understanding the ways that economies are gendered and based around social relations. And that should lead us to a different set of policies than what we've had in the past. And to really acknowledge that more of the same will not give us a different outcome, and that we need to change gears completely. And I think the last to say that South Africa needs a fiscal stimulus package that is really, tailored to the current moment and takes into consideration all these elements to revive our economy, and to also save the economy that we might have right now.
Busi, thank you very, very much indeed. Very clear thinking. Do you want to be Minister of Finance? I can make a few calls. Busi Sibeko, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Great talking to you.